History often tells us that Egypt fell because foreign empires were powerful. But the deeper truth is more uncomfortable. Egypt did not collapse in a single invasion or a single defeat. It thinned, it frayed, it aged under its own weight. Long before Assyrian boots crushed the dust of the Nile Valley, Egypt was already hollowing from the inside. Pharaohs still sat on thrones of gold, still wore crowns etched with divine symbols, but power no longer flowed cleanly from the palace. Authority leaked outward, slipping into the hands of provincial governors, temple estates, and military commanders who answered to themselves first. Archaeological records from the late Third Intermediate period show an Egypt divided into competing centers of power. Inscriptions in Thebes, Memphis, and the Delta no longer speak with one voice. Titles once reserved for the pharaoh appear on the tombs of local officials. Stele record decrees issued not by kings, but by high priests and regional lords. Egypt had not lost its crown, but it had lost control of it. Oral tradition remembers this era with quiet clarity. Nubian and Upper Egyptian memory speaks of the years when crowns were worn, but not carried. Kings existed, but they no longer walked Ma'at. They inherited thrones, but not obedience. Rituals were performed, but belief had thinned. Ceremony remained, but conviction did not. The temples, once pillars of balance, became rivals. Archaeological evidence from Karnak and Luxor shows expanding priestly estates that rivaled royal treasuries. Grain, gold, and labor flowed into temple storehouses beyond the pharaoh's reach. Priests controlled land, courts, and armed retainers. The gods were still honored, but their servants now competed with kings. Meanwhile, Egypt's armies changed in dangerous ways. Reliefs and military papyri show increasing reliance on foreign mercenaries. Libyans, Nubians, Greeks, Carians. These soldiers were effective, but detached. They fought for payment, not for Ma'at. Their loyalty could be bought and taken away. Internal conflicts drained Egypt's wealth. Repeated civil struggles left fortresses unfinished, canals neglected, and farmlands overtaxed. Archaeological soil studies in the Delta reveal periods of agricultural strain, likely caused by heavy extraction of grain to fund wars and monumental projects meant to project stability that no longer existed. Monuments still rose, but they rose on tired backs. Farmers, the foundation of Egypt's divine economy, began to disappear from records. Tax receipts preserved on ostraca tell of arrears, defaults, and abandoned fields. Some villages shrank, others vanished entirely. The land still flooded, but fewer hands remained to manage it. And this was the true fracture. Ma'at was not just a moral concept, it was an operating system, balance between ruler and ruled, between land and labor, between gods and people. When kings ruled for glory instead of harmony, Ma'at bent. When priests hoarded wealth meant for the land, Ma'at cracked. When armies answered generals instead of thrones, Ma'at broke. Temple texts from this period grow anxious. Prayers shift from confidence to pleading. Offerings increase, but inscriptions speak of uncertainty. The gods are still invoked, but now they must be convinced. Oral tradition holds that when Ma'at breaks, Egypt sends a signal beyond its borders, and history shows us this pattern again and again. When balance collapses, borders soften. When legitimacy thins, outsiders arrive. Assyria did not conquer a strong Egypt. It entered a divided one. Foreign rulers would later claim victory through force, but the truth is quieter and more painful. Egypt did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it forgot how to carry its crown. And when a civilization forgets the weight of its own balance, someone else will come to lift it, whether as savior or conqueror. This is how empires truly fall. As Egypt's native armies weakened, its rulers made a choice that would quietly reshape the future of the Nile. They hired protection. Greek, Carian, and Libyan mercenaries began appearing in royal service not as invaders, but as guests. Paid soldiers stationed at borders, temples, and palace gates. On papyrus, their presence looks practical. On stone reliefs, it looks controlled. But oral tradition remembers something more dangerous: men who guarded the house long enough to learn where the doors were. These soldiers had no ancestral tie to the land. They did not inherit Egypt through myth, flood, or burial ground. They did not swear loyalty to Ma'at. They swore contracts. Archaeology confirms their growing footprint. In the eastern delta, Greek-style pottery appears in military settlements long before the Greek conquest. At Naucratis, a trading post in name only, entire foreign quarters emerged, complete with sanctuaries, warehouses, and defensive planning. This was not temporary lodging. This was rooting. Egyptian rulers believed they were using outsiders without empowering them, but the mercenaries were learning Egypt faster than Egypt realized. They learned flood cycles, when armies could move and when they could not. They learned temple calendars, when priests gathered, when treasuries were full. They learned which governors feuded with which priests. They learned which borders were watched and which were ceremonial. Hidden within temple graffiti and soldier pay records is an uncomfortable truth. Foreign troops were often paid late, sometimes not at all. When loyalty is transactional, delay breeds resentment. Oral memory describes these periods as the years when guards watched the throne with hungry eyes, and still Egypt trusted them. Libyan mercenaries were settled on Egyptian land and given authority over local populations. Greek soldiers were allowed to marry Egyptian women, creating lineages that blended military knowledge with native legitimacy. These unions were not accidental. They were tolerated, even encouraged, to stabilize service. But they also blurred boundaries that had once been sacred. Egypt remained wealthy. Its granaries were full. The Nile still fed the land. Its temples still glowed with gold. But the walls protecting that wealth were now manned by those who had no spiritual obligation to defend it beyond payment. And this made Egypt vulnerable in a new way. Foreign powers beyond the horizon were watching: Assyrian envoys, Persian scouts, later Macedonian tacticians. They did not see an isolated kingdom. They saw a system already penetrated by men who spoke Greek, who understood Egyptian command structures, who knew which cities could be taken without burning. This is an often ignored truth. Egypt's conquerors did not arrive blind, they arrived informed. Some mercenaries left service and returned home carrying more than pay. They carried maps in memory, weaknesses in story, and confidence in possibility. Egypt was no longer unknowable. Oral tradition from Nubia and Upper Egypt preserves a warning spoken by elders of the time: a land guarded by strangers will one day be visited by their brothers. By the time Assyrian armies crossed into Egypt, the land had already been studied. When Persian forces arrived, they exploited pathways that had long been known. When Alexander entered, he encountered cities already accustomed to foreign command. Egypt had not been invaded suddenly, it had been slowly opened, not by enemies, but by necessity. The tragedy is not that Egypt hired mercenaries. Many great civilizations did. The tragedy is that Egypt forgot the difference between defense and dependence, and once that line vanished, Egypt remained sacred, but no longer sovereign. The land of the gods became a prize, and prizes are never left unclaimed. It was into this fractured Egypt that the Kushites rose, not as conquerors hungry for land, but as custodians answering a summons history had already made. From Nubia, south of the First Cataract, came rulers shaped by a memory Egypt itself was forgetting. Kushite oral tradition does not frame their northern movement as an invasion. It calls it the return of the elders. Elders, in Nubian cosmology, are not simply older, they are guardians of balance, those who remember the laws when others abandon them. Kings like Pie, Shabaka, Taharka, and Tantamani did not march north to overthrow Egypt's soul. They marched to retrieve it. This is not a metaphor. Pie's own victory stela, carved in stone at Gebel Barkal, tells the story in his own voice. He describes Egypt as ritually impure, its temples neglected, its priests compromised by political greed. Pie records that when he reached Thebes, he stopped to purify himself before entering the sacred city. He refused to accept victory until proper rites were performed. That detail is rarely emphasized, but it matters. A conqueror seizes a throne, a restorer cleanses it. Archaeology confirms what Kushite memory preserves. During the 25th dynasty, long-abandoned temples were repaired. Ancient architectural styles, already centuries old, were deliberately revived. Columns were built to resemble Old Kingdom forms. Religious texts were copied word for word from earlier dynasties, rejecting later innovations considered corrupt. This was not imitation. It was archival resurrection. The Kushite kings believed Egypt had strayed from Ma'at, and that Nubia, long connected to Egypt through religion, bloodlines and trade, had preserved what the north had lost. In Nubian belief, Amun did not abandon Egypt. Egypt abandoned Amun, and Nubia became his refuge. At Gebel Barkal, the sacred mountain of Kush, archaeologists have uncovered temples older than many northern sanctuaries. Nubian priests maintained rituals that Egypt itself had allowed to decay. When the Kushites ruled Egypt, these southern traditions flowed north again. Egyptian language was not imposed on Kush, it was already shared. Kushite rulers wrote in classical hieroglyphs long abandoned by northern elites. Their inscriptions are deliberately archaic, signaling legitimacy through continuity, not innovation. Modern historians later labeled these rulers the Black Pharaohs, but this term reveals more about modern discomfort than ancient reality. To the people of the time, they were simply pharaohs. They ruled from Memphis, they were crowned in Thebes, they made offerings at Karnak. Their names were inscribed inside cartouches. Their queens bore divine titles. Their sons were educated in Egyptian priesthoods, and yet they did not erase themselves to rule. Kushite identity remained visible. Nubian artistic styles appear in royal statuary. Kushite queens, the Kandakes, held unusual authority, reflecting Nubian matrilineal influence. Archaeological remains show Nubian court officials operating alongside Egyptian elites, not beneath them. This blending was intentional. Oral Nubian memory describes the 25th dynasty as the time when the river flowed both ways. Egypt influenced Kush. Kush restored Egypt. Neither erased the other. For a brief moment, Egypt stabilized. Trade revived. Temples functioned again as centers of moral authority, not political tools. Foreign mercenaries were reduced. Native forces were reorganized. The Nile corridor regained coherence. Even the Assyrians noticed. Their records speak of Egypt under Taharka, not as weak, but as defiant. This is why Assyrian campaigns against Egypt were brutal. They were not crushing a decaying kingdom. They were breaking a restoration. Hidden within Assyrian texts is a grudging respect. Egypt under the Kushites fought back, and that is the quiet truth history often avoids. The Kushite period was not Egypt's final decline. It was its last breath of ancient order, a breath rooted in Africa, a breath that later rulers would work deliberately to erase. When the Kushites were eventually forced back south by Assyrian armies, Egypt did not collapse immediately, but something essential was lost: the memory of African restoration, the evidence that Egypt had once been saved not by outsiders, but by its southern kin. Later dynasties would rewrite king lists, omit names, recast restorers as foreigners. Priestly historians like Manetho would reduce Kushite rule to a footnote or an embarrassment, but stone remembers what scrolls erase, and beneath the sand, temples rebuilt by Kushite hands still stand. For that moment, brief, defiant, and deeply African, Egypt breathed again. Beyond the Nile's green ribbon, a different power was rising, one that did not measure authority by ritual purity or ancestral memory, but by fear carefully engineered. The Assyrian Empire did not come seeking gods. It came carrying siege engines. From their capitals at Nineveh and Ashur, Assyrian kings built what was, for its time, the most efficient war machine the world had ever seen. Archaeology confirms this, not through poetry, but through stone reliefs carved with chilling precision. Walls at Nineveh show cities flayed open, captives impaled, rivers clogged with bodies. These were not exaggerations, they were warnings. Assyrian warfare was psychological before it was physical. Kushite oral tradition refers to them not as an empire, but as the people who burned memory. A telling phrase. Assyrians did not simply defeat kingdoms, they erased resistance as an example to others. When Taharqa rose to power, Egypt was no longer fragmented, but it was surrounded. Assyria had already crushed the Levant, Phoenician cities fell, Judah bent, Tyre paid tribute. Egypt was next, not because it was weak, but because it was rich, fertile, and symbolically powerful. Assyrian records mention Egypt repeatedly as the land of grain and gods. Control Egypt and the Mediterranean balance shifted. Taharqa did not submit. This is crucial and often softened in modern summaries. He fought. Archaeological evidence at sites like Memphis and the Delta shows hurried fortifications, expanded garrisons, and weapon caches dated precisely to his reign. Nubian-style fortresses appear further north than ever before. Kushite cavalry, rarely discussed, was deployed strategically along river corridors. Assyrian annals themselves admit repeated failures. They describe campaigns where Egyptian Kushite forces regrouped after defeat. Cities like Memphis changed hands more than once. Taharqa fled, returned, and counterattacked. This was not a single collapse, it was a grinding war of attrition. Kushite oral memory calls this period the wrestling of lions. Two powers locked, neither willing to yield, but Assyria had one advantage that Kush could not match: endurance through terror. Assyrian kings rotated armies, losses were replaced. Campaigns were annual, systematic, merciless. They burned fields deliberately. They targeted temples, not to loot, but to demoralize populations who believed divine protection still mattered. In contrast, Kushite warfare was bound by ritual limits. Certain cities could not be desecrated. Certain seasons restricted campaigns. Certain sanctuaries were inviolable. Assyria had no such boundaries. When Taharqa eventually retreated south, it was not a rout. It was a strategic withdrawal, what Nubian oral tradition calls closing the gate before the flood. The Kushite kings understood something crucial. Nubia could survive without Egypt. Egypt could not survive the endless Assyrian war. They chose survival. Antamani, Taharqa's successor, would attempt one final return. His dream stela, another often overlooked artifact, records a vision in which the gods urge him to reclaim Egypt. He briefly succeeded, reasserting control over parts of the Nile Valley. Assyria responded with overwhelming force, The sack of Thebes was not just military, it was symbolic. Temples were stripped, statues were carried away. Sacred wealth was paraded through Assyrian streets. Archaeological layers in Thebes show abrupt destruction, followed by abandonment. And then, silence. But the most dangerous phase did not begin with Assyrian occupation. It began after the Kushites left. With the old order broken, Egypt did not return to balance. Instead, it entered an age of memory manipulation. Local rulers, installed or tolerated by Assyria, needed legitimacy without African restoration. They could not claim divine renewal. They could only claim a difference. And so began something more insidious than invasion: selective memory. Kushite names quietly disappeared from king lists. Temple inscriptions stopped mentioning Nubian restorations. Later, scribes reframed the 25th dynasty as foreign disruption rather than salvation. Archaeology exposes the contradiction. Kushite-built temples continued to function. Their repairs remained visible. Their statues were reused, reinscribed, reburied, but not destroyed. Egypt could not erase them physically, so it erased them narratively. This is why, centuries later, Greek historians encountered an Egypt that spoke of its African restorers only in whispers. Why Roman writers found gaps in dynastic records. Why modern textbooks long struggled to reconcile material evidence with written omissions. Assyria broke Egypt's defenses, but what followed broke its historical honesty. The Kushites did not vanish. They ruled Nubia for centuries afterward. Their pyramids still rise at Meroe, more numerous than Egypt's, sharper, steeper, deliberately distinct. Their writing systems evolved independently. Their queens ruled openly. Their gods endured. But Egypt would never again allow itself to be restored by Africa without resistance. And that, more than conquest, is how an ancient truth was buried, not beneath sand, but beneath silence. After the Assyrians withdrew from Egypt, they did not leave behind freedom. They left behind architecture of control. Assyrian policy was not a long-term occupation. It was disruption, punishment, and delegation. Once Egypt was sufficiently weakened, Assyria installed compliant local rulers, men who could govern Egypt without restoring its former power. From this strategy emerged the Site dynasty, beginning with Psamtik, the first of Sais in the western delta. On the surface, Psamtik I appeared to be a revival of native Egyptian rule. He wore the crowns. He restored temples. He spoke the old language of kingship. Archaeology confirms extensive rebuilding during his reign. But beneath the revival was something more calculated. Psamtik I ruled an Egypt that could not afford memory. He understood a dangerous truth. The Kushite past proved that Egypt could be ruled and restored by Africans from the south, and that truth threatened every ruler who came after. To secure legitimacy, the Site kings needed separation, not from Assyria, but from Nubia. This is where erasure began, not with fire, but with silence. Archaeologically, something strange happened after the 25th dynasty. Kushite monuments remain standing. Kushite temples continue functioning. Kushite repairs are visible in stone. Yet their names begin to vanish from official narratives. Royal king lists, such as those carved in temples or preserved in later texts, skip from the 24th dynasty to the Sate rulers as if the Kushites never existed. This was not accidental. Egyptian culture believed that to erase a name was to kill the soul a second time. So the Kushites were not smashed or defaced en masse. That would have acknowledged them. Instead, they were excluded. This is one of the most sophisticated forms of historical manipulation ever recorded. Modern scholars often miss this because they look for destruction. Ancient Egyptians practiced subtraction. Temple inscriptions were subtly altered. References to restoration by the kings of Kush were replaced with vague phrases like renewed in ancient times. Stelae that once bore Kushite dedications were recarved with site names, sometimes awkwardly, leaving Nubian stylistic fingerprints underneath. Archaeologists can still see this: different carving depth, different proportions, different stone working traditions layered atop one another. The stone remembers what texts tried to forget. Centuries later, during the Ptolemaic period, an Egyptian priest named Manetho compiled a dynastic history of Egypt for Greek rulers. His work would shape how Egypt was understood for over 2,000 years. And here, the erasure became permanent. Manetho grouped the Kushite rulers with the Hyksos, foreign invaders remembered in Egyptian memory as chaotic, impure, and destructive. This was historically inaccurate, but politically useful because it reframed African restoration as African contamination. By casting the Kushites as illegitimate intruders, later dynasties could claim uninterrupted continuity while quietly severing Egypt's African reconnection. This narrative was eagerly adopted by Greek and Roman writers, who already believed civilization flowed north and west, not south. Thus, a lie became tradition. Yet archaeology refuses to cooperate. Kushite rulers did not dismantle Egypt, they revived it. They restored temples abandoned for generations. They revived archaic artistic styles intentionally, signaling reverence for Egypt's oldest traditions. They rebuilt Karnak, Luxor, and Memphis. Taharqa alone constructed more monuments across Egypt than many native dynasties combined. This is not occupational behavior. This is custodianship. Even Assyrian records, hostile by nature, acknowledge Kushite piety and administrative competence. They never described them as chaotic barbarians. They described them as formidable kings, which raises the question: if the Kushites were so destructive, why did Egypt flourish briefly under them? Nubian oral tradition never forgot. In Sudanese communities along the Nile, elders still recount this era as the time Egypt remembered itself. Kushite kings are remembered not as conquerors, but as guardians who crossed north because Egypt had abandoned Ma'at. One Nubian proverb says, "When the house of your mother burns, you do not ask permission to carry water." To Nubia, Egypt was family, and that made their erasure painful, but expected. Nubian oral histories explain the silence bluntly. They erased us because we showed them what balance looked like. Another tradition states that the site rulers feared the Kushite memory, because it proved that kingship did not belong to one land, but to moral order. If Ma'at could return from Nubia once, it could return. So the safest move was to forget. This manipulation did not end in antiquity. Early European Egyptologists, working in the 18th and 19th centuries, relied heavily on Manetho's framework. Many were already invested in theories that separated Egypt from sub-Saharan Africa, so they welcomed a narrative where African rulers were anomalies, interruptions, or corruptions. Kushite achievements were attributed to Egyptian influence. Nubian independence was minimized. Their pyramids were dismissed as imitations, despite being structurally distinct and historically later. Thus, ancient political propaganda merged seamlessly with modern racial bias. A perfect erasure. Today, archaeology is reversing this silence. Radiocarbon dating confirms Kushite timelines. Inscriptions reanalyzed reveal Nubian authorship. Sudan's pyramids stand as undeniable proof of sovereign African civilization. And slowly, the truth reemerges. The Black Pharaohs were not erased because they failed Egypt. They were erased because they succeeded and reminded Egypt and the world that African kings once restored the Nile when Egypt could not restore itself.